does it mean to be Melungeon? In the mountains of Virginia and other Appalachian states, mixed-race people have long eked out a living, while questions about their intriguing origins have persisted.
Deep in the shadow of the Clinch Mountains, a people lived in the silence of the ridges, possessing olive skin, blue eyes, and hair as dark as midnight. They were called the Melungeons, a lost tribe that history tried to erase. For centuries, they were branded as outcasts, their origins hidden behind a veil of myths ranging from Phoenician sailors to shipwrecked pirates. But the truth wasn't lost in the clouds. It was written in their blood all along. But myths are often just armor worn to protect a dangerous truth. The legend of the lost tribe. The mist that clings to the peaks of Hancock County, Tennessee, does more than just cool the air. It guards a secret that has been whispered for over 2 centuries. To the early settlers of the Appalachian frontier, the Melungeons were a phantom race, a group of people who didn't fit into the rigid black and white boxes of the burgeoning American census. They were an anomaly of the high country, living in isolated communities and speaking an archaic form of English, yet possessing features that suggested worlds far beyond the Atlantic coast. They were the people of the ridges, the gray people, who existed in the peripheral vision of the American story, often feared and almost always misunderstood. To the white pioneers moving westward, encountering a community of dark-skinned, European-acting people already established in the mountains was a cognitive dissonance they couldn't resolve. For generations, the word Melungeon was used as a slur.
A mystery.
A matter of self-preservation.
A people.
Melungeon.
A whispered threat used to frighten children, or a legal brand used to strip men of their right to vote. Because they did not look like the Scots-Irish settlers around them, and because they did not claim the heritage of the local Cherokee, they were forced into a social limbo. To be Melungeon was to be a person without a history, or rather, a person whose history was so controversial that it had to be buried beneath layers of romanticized fiction. The lack of a clear origin story allowed the vacuum to be filled by the wildest imaginations of the era. If the neighbors couldn't explain where these people came from, they would invent a pedigree that sounded sufficiently distant and noble to justify their presence on the land. They were called the descendants of Madoc's Welsh explorers, the remnants of the lost colony of Roanoke, or perhaps even the survivors of a Portuguese shipwreck. Some researchers in the 19th century even posited that they were one of the 10 lost tribes of Israel, or perhaps the offspring of ancient Carthaginian sailors who had blown off course.
Made up of European, Native Americans, maybe even shipwrecked Portuguese sailors.
These theories weren't just idle curiosity. They were intellectual lifelines. By attaching the Melungeon people to a noble or exotic ancient lineage, they were effectively removed from the immediate racial tensions of the American South. If they were Portuguese or Moorish, they could bypass the restrictive laws that targeted those of African or indigenous descent. The folklore grew so thick that it eventually became the accepted reality of the mountains. Families began to believe their own myths, passing down stories of Mediterranean ancestors who had crossed the sea long before the Mayflower. This oral tradition served as a psychological shield against the crushing weight of the Jim Crow South. In the tiny cabins of Newman's Ridge, the secret was kept behind closed doors, hidden in the silence of grandmothers who refused to speak of the past. They knew that in a world obsessed with blood purity, the mystery was their only protection. The courtroom gave them a name, but the laboratory gave them a past. The legal mask. In the heat of the 19th century American South, identity was not a matter of personal feeling. It was a matter of law. The Melungeons found themselves trapped in a binary legal system that only recognized 2 speeds, white and black. Because their skin was often bronze and their heritage was unknown, they became a target for a society obsessed with drawing lines in the dirt.
My grandma, she was half Turk, half black. My grandpa was a white man.
To be labeled free person of color meant losing the right to own a gun, the right to vote, and the right to defend one's property in court. For the families living on the ridges, the mystery of their origins became a vital legal defense. They realized very early that if they were seen as mixed race in the American sense, they would be stripped of their humanity. But if they were exotic, they might just be spared. This desperation led to what historians now call the Portuguese mask. When census takers or tax collectors knocked on doors in the Appalachian foothills, Melungeon families began to claim they were of Portuguese descent. It was a brilliant, albeit fragile, survival strategy. By claiming a Mediterranean heritage, they were essentially telling the government they were dark-skinned Caucasians rather than people of African or Native American descent. This wasn't just a lie. For many, it became a deeply held family truth, a shield passed down from father to son to ensure that the family farm wouldn't be seized. The courts were often forced to grapple with this ambiguity, as judges struggled to categorize a people who looked Middle Eastern but lived like pioneers. One of the most famous instances of this legal tightrope walk occurred in the mid-1800s during a trial involving the right to vote. A Melungeon man's heritage was put on trial, and the community watched with bated breath to see if the law would cast them into the darkness of disenfranchisement. The defense didn't argue for equality. They argued for otherness. They leaned into the myths of Phoenicians and explorers, providing a romanticized alternative to the reality of the American frontier. The court eventually ruled in favor of the Melungeons, not because they were seen as white, but because they were seen as not black. This precarious middle ground allowed them to exist in a social twilight, neither fully accepted nor fully cast out. However, the pressure intensified with the rise of the eugenics movement in the early 20th century. Men like Walter Plecker,
Now, Walter Plecker wasn't a governor or a general. He wasn't a man with an army.
first registrar of Virginia's Bureau of Vital Statistics, made it their life's mission to eliminate the middle ground. Plecker believed that the Melungeons were trying to pass and contaminate the white race. He issued warnings to local officials, listing Melungeon surnames and demanding they be classified as colored, regardless of their appearance or their Portuguese claims. This era of paper genocide forced the Melungeon secret even deeper into the mountains. Families burned old letters, stopped speaking of their ancestors, and retreated further into the isolation of the Clinch Mountains to avoid the prying eyes of the racial purists. As the mountains grew taller, the paper trail grew thinner. The DNA revolution. For decades, the Melungeon mystery was a battle of stories, a tug-of-war between oral tradition and prejudiced history. But in the early 21st century, the debate shifted from the courtroom to the laboratory. The advent of modern genetic testing provided a tool that didn't care about social masks or local legends. In 2012, a landmark study led by Roberta Estes and a team of researchers sought to settle the matter once and for all. They didn't just look at general ancestry, they focused on the Y chromosome, passed from father to son, and mitochondrial DNA, passed from mother to child. These genetic markers act as a biological GPS tracing a direct line back to a person's geographical origin, regardless of what is written on a birth certificate. The results were a seismic shock to the Appalachian community and a final blow to the more exotic myths. The study analyzed the DNA of hundreds of descendants of the core Melungeon families, names like Mullins, Gibson, Goins, and Collins. What they found was not the genetic signature of shipwrecked Portuguese sailors, lost Welshmen, or ancient Carthaginians. Instead, the Y chromosomes overwhelmingly pointed toward sub-Saharan African origins, while the mitochondrial DNA primarily showed Northern and Central European lineages. This was the crack in the mystery. The Melungeons were the descendants of unions between sub-Saharan African men and white European women. This revelation reframed the entire Melungeon narrative. It proved that the Portuguese claim was indeed a social fiction, a brilliant survival mechanism designed to protect these families from the brutal one-drop rule of the South. In the eyes of the law during the 1700s and 1800s, admitting to African ancestry meant immediate loss of status, property, and freedom. By identifying as Portuguese,
made up of European, Native Americans, maybe even shipwrecked Portuguese sailors.
they weren't necessarily trying to lie. They were using the only available category that allowed them to remain free and keep their land. The DNA showed that these families had been mixed since the very beginning of the American experiment, long before the United States was even a country. Furthermore, the genetic data revealed a smaller but significant amount of Native American DNA, confirming that these communities were truly triracial. They were a microcosm of the early colonial frontier, a place where the boundaries between races were far more fluid than later historians wanted to admit. The DNA didn't just show who they were, it showed where they came from. The African markers found in the Melungeon lines were often associated with the very first arrivals in the Virginia colony. These were the descendants of people who had been free people of color in the mid-1600s, individuals who had once owned land and held status before the Iron Curtain of racial slavery fully descended and hardened. Cracking the code meant acknowledging a truth that was, for some, harder to swallow than the myths. For some descendants, the news was a shock that disrupted their sense of self. For others, it was a profound liberation. The DNA stripped away the mystery and replaced it with a complex human reality. It proved that the Melungeons weren't a lost tribe from a distant land, but a uniquely American people born out of the collision of three continents. They were the physical evidence of a history that the authorities had tried to legislate out of existence. The lab results didn't just provide a list of haplogroups, they provided a roadmap of a migration that had been hidden for 300 years. The DNA was the map, but the history books were the compass. The hidden migration. To understand how these families ended up on the high ridges of Tennessee, one must look back to the 17th century tidewater region of Virginia. Long before the plantation system became the rigid economic engine of the South, the colonial frontier was a chaotic, experimental place. In the mid-1600s, the lines between indentured servants of European descent and those of African descent were often blurred. In this early window of history, some African men completed their terms of service, acquired land, and integrated into the colonial social fabric. They married English and Scotch-Irish women, often fellow servants, creating the first generation of multiracial families in the New World. As the century progressed, however, the Virginia House of Burgesses began passing increasingly restrictive laws to separate the races and solidify the institution of chattel slavery. These families, who were once part of the pioneer middle class, suddenly found themselves in a legal crosshair. They were free people of color, a category that the growing white elite viewed with suspicion and hostility. To escape the tightening noose of systemic racism and the exhaustion of the coastal soil, these families began a century-long trek westward. They weren't just looking for better land. They were looking for a place where the law couldn't reach them, and where their complex heritage wouldn't be a liability. The migration path followed the frontier trail along the Appalachian Range. They moved from the Virginia Tidewater into the Piedmont, then into the mountains of North Carolina, and finally into the remote corners of East Tennessee and Southwest Virginia. Each move took them further into the rugged, less desirable terrain, the steep ridges and deep hollows that the large-scale planters didn't want. These locations provided a natural fortress. In the isolation of the mountains, they formed tight-knit kinship networks, intermarrying within a small circle of families to preserve their community and their freedom. Names like Gowan, Chavis, and Gibson appear in records in the 1600s and reappear a century later in the Clinch Mountains. This was not a random wandering, it was a strategic retreat. By the time they reached the Newman's Ridge area, in the late 1700s, they had become a distinct subculture. They were the pioneers, often arriving in the wilderness decades before the main wave of Scotch-Irish settlement. Because they arrived so early and settled in such inaccessible places, they managed to maintain their independence for generations. They built their own schools, churches, and social structures, effectively creating a shadow country within the Appalachian frontier. The hidden migration was a flight from a census that wanted to categorize them and a legal system that wanted to enslave them. By the time the outside world took notice of them in the mid-hundreds, their origins in the colonial tidewater had been forgotten by everyone except the oldest grandmothers. They had successfully disappeared into the geography, leaving behind the paperwork of the coast for the freedom of the peaks. The mountains didn't just provide a home. They provided a sanctuary where a forbidden history could be kept in a state of suspended animation. But the world eventually climbed the ridges, and the sanctuary became a prison of silence. America's darkest secret. The crushing weight of the Melungeon story lies not in the mystery of their blood, but in the necessity of the lie. This is America's darkest secret, a centuries-long history of ethnic cleansing through paperwork. The Melungeons were the living embodiment of a truth that the American racial project could not allow to exist. They were proof that the foundations of the country were built on a fluid, multiracial reality, rather than the myth of racial purity. To admit that the Melungeons existed, and that they were a blend of the very people the law was trying to keep apart, was to admit that the entire legal and social structure of the South was a fragile fabrication. For much of the 20th century, this suppression was led by the bureaucratic terror of men like Walter Plecker. As the head of Virginia's Bureau of Vital Statistics, Plecker engaged in a campaign of documentary genocide. He understood that if you change a person's birth certificate, you change their history and their rights. He systematically reclassified Melungeon families from white, or Portuguese, to colored, effectively erasing their unique heritage and stripping them of their standing in society. This was the dark heart of the American racial obsession, a relentless drive to categorize, to separate, and to simplify the messy reality of human connection into a binary of black and white. This forced the Melungeon people into a state of psychological trauma that lasted for generations. Parents stopped telling their children where they came from to protect them. The mystery became a survival mechanism, but it came at a staggering cost: the loss of self. People grew up looking in the mirror and seeing features they couldn't name, hearing whispers they couldn't understand, and feeling a deep sense of shame about a past they weren't allowed to know. The darkest secret wasn't that they had African or Native American blood. It was that the American dream had no room for them unless they wore a mask. By the time the secret was finally cracked by geneticists, much of the damage had been done. The erasure of Melungeon identity served as a blueprint for how a society can systematically delete an entire group of people from the collective memory. It shows how easily history can be manipulated by those in power to serve a specific racial narrative. The Melungeon secret remains a haunting reminder that in the quest for a pure national identity, thousands of families were forced to choose between their heritage and their survival, leaving a hole in the heart of Appalachian history that we are only now beginning to fill. The lab results were a verdict, but the people were the final witnesses. The modern legacy. Today, the word Melungeon is no longer spoken in the fearful whispers of the past. Instead, it has become a badge of resilience and a catalyst for a massive movement of ancestral reclamation. In the digital age, the descendants of the Ridges have moved from the shadows of Hancock County to the forefront of genealogical research. The modern legacy of the Melungeons is defined by a refusal to be defined by others. For many, the genetic cracking of the mystery was not an end, but a beginning. A chance to finally look back at their ancestors not as a lost tribe, but as a founding people of the American frontier who survived against impossible odds. The annual Melungeon Union and various heritage festivals have transformed what was once a source of shame into a celebration of diversity. These gatherings bring together people who might have spent their lives on different sides of the racial divide, only to discover they share the same DNA and the same pioneer's blood. This reclamation has a profound social impact. It challenges the traditional narrative of Appalachia as a purely white Scots-Irish enclave. By acknowledging the Melungeon presence, the region is rediscovering its true identity as a melting pot of European, African, and indigenous cultures that blended long before the concept of multiculturalism ever existed. However, the legacy also carries a sting of bittersweet irony. The very science that liberated the Melungeons from the mystery also confirmed that the legends of Portuguese kings and shipwrecked sailors were largely survivalist fiction. Reconciling the cherished family stories with the cold reality of the genetic report has been a painful process for some. Yet, the consensus among the community has shifted toward embracing the truth. The real story, one of free people of color carving out a life of liberty in the face of systemic oppression, is arguably more heroic than any myth of a lost Mediterranean prince. The mystery has ended, but the story is finally beginning to be told. If you haven't, subscribe to our channel for more stories like this. Thanks for watching.